I stood outside my daughter-in-law's company holding a small wrapped box, ready to surprise her with an anniversary gift for a marriage she was living in half alone. A guard laughed in my face when I told him who I was. "Sir, I see her father-in-law every single day," he said, pointing across the lobby at a stranger in a $2,000 suit, waving to employees like he owned the place. My son had been gone for 2 years. I'd been told he was overseas working, building something for our family's future. Standing there watching another man wear his life like a costume, I understood all at once that everything I'd been told was a lie, and I hadn't even scratched the surface of how deep it went. The man wearing my face. "My name is Walter Griggs. I'm 66 years old, a retired mechanical engineer from a small town outside Dayton, Ohio. And for most of my life, I believed the world made sense if you were patient enough and paid close enough attention to it. Machines don't lie to you. If something's broken, you can trace the fault back through the system, piece by piece, until you find exactly where it failed. People I've learned the hard way don't work like that. People can hide a fault for years, smiling the whole time, and you'd never know anything was wrong until the entire structure came down around you. My son Daniel is my only child. His mother passed when he was 19, and after that it was just the two of us for a long stretch of years before he met Claire. I remember the first time he brought her home, how she sat at my kitchen table, asking me real questions about my old projects. Not the polite kind people ask to be nice, but the kind that meant she actually wanted to understand who I was. I liked her immediately. When Daniel married her, I gained the daughter in every way that mattered. And when Claire's tech company took off 2 years into their marriage, when she became CEO of a growing analytics firm that had genuinely impressive people paying attention to it, I was prouder of her than I think I let on. Then a little over 2 years ago, Daniel sat across from me at that same kitchen table and told me he was taking an extended assignment overseas, something to do with expanding operations for a company he worked with in supply chain consulting. He said it would be 6 months, maybe 8. He said the money was good, that it would set them up well for the future, especially with a baby on the way. At the time, my granddaughter Ellie, who's now nearly 2 years old, and who I've mostly only known through photographs Claire sends me. 6 months became a year. A year became 2. The calls got shorter, more strained always, with some excuse about time zones or bad connections, or being pulled into back-to-back meetings. "Dad, don't worry, it's just the work," he'd tell me, and I believed him because that's what you do with your own son. You believe him, even when some quiet part of you starts keeping a list of things that don't quite add up. Claire, when I'd ask, always had the same answer delivered a little too smoothly. "He's fine, Walter. He's just buried in it right now." And there was something in her eyes when she said it, something I told myself was just the exhaustion of raising a toddler mostly alone, but that sat wrong with me in a way I couldn't name. 3 weeks ago, I decided I'd had enough of secondhand reassurances. Ellie's second birthday was coming up, and I'd found going through some old boxes a pocket watch that had belonged to Daniel's grandfather, the kind of thing I wanted to give Claire in person for their anniversary, since Daniel wasn't there to do it himself. I drove the 4 hours out to the city where Claire's company was headquartered, a gleaming glass building downtown that still felt strange to me, knowing my daughter-in-law ran the whole operation from somewhere up on the 9th floor. There was a sign at the entrance, black lettering on brushed steel, "Employees only beyond this point." A young guard sat at the security desk, maybe 25, friendly enough, the kind of easy confidence you see in people who've never had a reason to doubt what they think they know. "I'm here to see Claire," I told him. "I'm her father-in-law." He smiled, not rudely, just amused the way you smile at a joke you've heard a version of before. "Sir, I see her father-in-law every single day," he said, and something in the casual certainty of it made the back of my neck go cold before my mind had even caught up to why. He gestured with his chin toward the lobby behind him. "There he goes right now, actually." I turned, and for a moment my whole body simply refused to process what I was looking at. A man was walking across that lobby with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged there, completely silver-templed, maybe 60, wearing a suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who wear them often. He wasn't Daniel. He wasn't anyone I recognized at all. But he moved through that space like he owned a piece of it, nodding at 2 employees who greeted him by name, stopping briefly to say something to a young woman carrying a stack of folders, who laughed at whatever he said. I stood frozen at that security desk, my son's grandfather's watch still wrapped in tissue paper inside my jacket pocket, watching a complete stranger wear the role of my son's life in front of a building full of people who had no reason to doubt it. Every instinct in me wanted to walk over, grab that man by the shoulder, and demand to know who the hell he thought he was. 40 years of engineering had taught me something else, though, that when a system is broken in a way you don't yet understand, the worst thing you can do is start pulling wires before you know what they connect to. So instead, I thanked the guard, told him I must have the wrong building, and stepped back outside into the afternoon sun, my heart pounding, already deciding I wasn't leaving this city until I understood exactly what I just walked into. I found a bench across the street with a clear view of the entrance and sat down to wait, and I didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes later, the same man walked back out through those glass doors, phone pressed to his ear, laughing at something. He passed close enough that I caught a few words as he walked by the young receptionist stationed near the entrance, speaking to her like she'd expect nothing less from him. "Tell Claire I'll pick up Ellie from preschool this afternoon," he said, easy and warm, like it was something he did all the time. I sat there on that bench for a long moment after he'd gone, feeling something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. My son had been gone for 2 years, and somehow in that time, another man had quietly stepped into his place in his wife's company, in his daughter's life, and nobody around me seemed to think there was anything strange about it at all. 2 years my son went missing. I sat on that bench for nearly an hour after the stranger left, letting the whole shape of my son's disappearance run back through my mind, this time looking for the cracks I'd been too trusting to notice the first time around. It started, if I'm honest with myself, with small things. Daniel had always called me every Sunday without fail ever since he moved out of my house at 22. Even when he was traveling for work, even when the time difference meant he was calling me at some ungodly hour of his own morning just to catch me before I went to bed, he called. That was Daniel, steady, reliable, the kind of son who remembered his father's blood pressure medication schedule better than I did. When the overseas assignment started, those calls became less regular almost immediately, which struck me as strange even then, because if anything, a man far from home should want to hear his father's voice more, not less. "It's just the time zones, Dad," he told me the few times we did manage to connect. His voice on those calls had a strained quality to it that I chalked up to exhaustion. Some weeks I'm working around the clock. I'll call more when things settle down. Things never settled down. 6 months in, I asked him directly where exactly he was stationed. I wanted to send him something for his birthday, a care package, the kind of thing I used to do when he was in college. He gave me an address that, when I later tried looking it up out of simple curiosity, turned out to belong to a mail forwarding service, not an actual residence. When I brought that up to him on our next call, he laughed it off. Said the company handled things through a central logistics office for security reasons given the nature of the contracts they worked on. It sounded reasonable enough at the time. I didn't push. Claire, meanwhile, became my primary source of information about my own son, which in hindsight should have bothered me more than it did. Every few weeks I'd call her, ask how Daniel was doing, and she'd give me some version of the same answer. "He's fine, he's busy. He sends his love, he'll call when he can." There was a particular way she'd say it, a slight hesitation, before the words came out, like she was choosing each one carefully instead of simply telling me the truth. I remember one call in particular, maybe a year ago, when I asked more pointedly than usual when Daniel might be coming home. And there was a long silence on the line before she said, "Soon, Walter. I hope soon," in a voice that sounded less like reassurance and more like someone trying to convince herself. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that grief and worry can make an old man suspicious of shadows, and that my son was a grown man, capable of managing his own life without his father hovering over every decision. I have spent the last 3 weeks since that afternoon on the bench, deeply ashamed of how easily I accepted that story, how willing I was to let my own instincts be talked down by simple reassurance from people I loved. Now, sitting outside that glass building, watching a stranger walk in and out of my daughter-in-law's company like he belonged there, I understood that my instincts had been right the entire time. I just hadn't had the courage or maybe the evidence to act on them. I checked into a hotel a few blocks from Claire's office that evening, canceling the drive home I'd originally planned, telling myself I'd stay one more day and try to understand what I was actually looking at before I did anything rash. I spent the next morning back on that same bench watching the building with the patient, methodical attention I used to bring to a malfunctioning system on a job site. Observe, first diagnose, Second act, only once you understand the fault completely. The man appeared again around 10 this time, walking with two other executives I didn't recognize, gesturing animatedly about something on a tablet one of them was holding. I watched him take the elevator up, watched through the glass as he greeted the receptionist by name again. Watched the easy practice comfort of someone who had clearly been doing this for a long time. Not days, not weeks, but months, maybe longer. I struck up a conversation with a young woman on a smoke break outside a marketing associate named Priya, who seemed happy enough to chat with a friendly older stranger, asking harmless questions about the building. I asked as casually as I could manage about the older gentleman I'd seen going in and out that morning. "Oh, that's Mr. Bennett," she said easily. "Senior advisor to Claire. He's basically family, her father-in-law actually. Sweetest guy, always brings donuts on Fridays." I felt something in my chest go very still the way it does right before a piece of machinery you've been listening to for years suddenly makes a sound that shouldn't be there. "Her father-in-law," I repeated slowly. "Yeah," Priya said, not noticing anything strange in my expression. "He's practically run point on half her big decisions since her husband's been overseas. Honestly, don't know what she'd do without him." I thanked her, walked back to my hotel room in a daze, and sat on the edge of that stiff mattress, turning the pieces over in my mind until they formed a picture I didn't want to look at directly. A stranger had inserted himself into my family, using my own title. My own relationship to Claire, wearing it like a costume, convincing enough that an entire company of educated, capable people had simply accepted it without question. And somewhere in the middle of all this, my son, the real father-in-law this man had replaced, had vanished so completely that his absence had left a space wide enough for someone else to fill. That night, lying awake in that unfamiliar hotel room, my phone rang. The number on the screen was unlisted, no name attached. Something told me to answer it anyway. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end long enough that I almost hung up, and then a voice came through, low, urgent, and unmistakably familiar, in a way that made every hair on my arm stand up, though I couldn't place why. "You shouldn't have come here, Walter," the voice whispered. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into." Part 3. The man named Bennett? The line went dead before I could say a word, and I sat there on the edge of that hotel bed for a long time afterward, my phone still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing but my own pulse. I didn't recognize the voice enough to place it exactly, but something about its cadence, some buried familiarity in the rhythm of how it formed words, kept nagging at me through the rest of that sleepless night. By morning, I'd made a decision. I wasn't driving home. I wasn't going to sit on a bench across the street hoping to stumble into more answers by accident. I was going to find out properly and carefully exactly who this man calling himself Bennett actually was. I called Ray Doskovich the next morning. Ray and I had worked together for nearly 2 decades back at the plant, and after he retired from engineering himself, he'd built a modest second career doing background and fraud investigation work for insurance companies, the kind of quiet, methodical detective work that suited a man who'd spent his whole career solving problems most people couldn't see the shape of. Ray had helped me once before years ago, when a contractor tried to cheat me on a home renovation, and he'd never once made me feel foolish for needing help. I trusted him completely, and more importantly, I trusted his discretion. "Send me what you've got," Ray said once I'd explained the situation over the phone, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "Photo if you can get, one full name if you have it, and anything about the company itself. Give me a few days." Getting a photo wasn't difficult. I positioned myself near the building's entrance again the following morning with my phone held low, and when Bennett walked out around 11, deep in conversation with someone on his cell phone, I managed several clear shots of his face without drawing attention to myself. I sent them to Ray, along with everything Priya had told me, and whatever scraps I'd gathered from simply watching the building's rhythms over the past several days. Ray called me back 2 days later, and I could hear something serious in his voice the moment he said my name. "His real name is Gordon Hale," Ray said. "Took some digging because he's been operating under Bennett for a while now, but the facial match came back solid once I ran it through a few databases. Walter, this man has a history." Gordon Hale, as it turned out, had been a business partner in a logistics and analytics firm nearly 15 years earlier, a firm that had collapsed under a cloud of fraud allegations after Hale was accused of funneling client investment funds into shell accounts he controlled personally. He'd never been formally convicted. The case had been settled quietly out of court, the kind of resolution wealthy, well-connected men often manage when the alternative is a messy public trial. He disappeared from any kind of visible business record for almost a decade after that resurfacing, only in the last 2 years under this new identity, this new charm, this new name that apparently nobody at Claire's company had ever thought to question. 2 years. I repeated slowly, feeling that number settle into my chest like a stone. That's exactly when Daniel supposedly left for his overseas assignment. I noticed that too, Ray said quietly. Walter, I don't like the timing on this at all. I didn't either. I spent the rest of that day walking the streets near Claire's office, trying to organize the pieces into some shape that made sense. And the harder I looked, the more convinced I became that Claire herself knew more than she'd ever let on. I thought back to every strained phone call, every careful pause, before she answered a simple question about her own husband's whereabouts. A woman running a company as sharp and successful as hers didn't accidentally let a man with Gordon Hale's history walk into a senior advisory role without knowing exactly who he was. Which meant whatever was happening here, Claire wasn't an innocent bystander being deceived alongside me. She was protecting something, or someone. That thought led me somewhere I probably should have gone from the very beginning. Daniel and Claire's old apartment, the one they'd lived in before Claire's promotion to CEO, afforded them the newer place across town. I still had a spare key from years back, from a time I'd watered their plants during a vacation, and though I knew it was likely they'd change the locks, since curiosity got the better of caution. I drove past the old building that evening and on impulse parked and walked up to the third floor, standing outside the familiar door for a long moment, before I noticed something that stopped me cold. A light on inside, faint movement. Behind the curtains, a stack of mail visible through the small window beside the door that wasn't addressed to Claire at all. I knocked, my heart hammering, half expecting Gordon Hale himself to answer. Instead, an elderly woman I didn't recognize opened the door a few inches, chain still latched, eyeing me with understandable suspicion. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I think I have the wrong apartment. I was looking for my son, Daniel Griggs. He used to live here with his wife." Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of recognition quickly masked. "Wrong place?" she said a little too fast, and shut the door before I could ask anything further. I stood in that hallway for a long moment, every instinct I had screaming that I just brushed up against something real, something someone was actively trying to keep hidden. I went around back to where I remembered a small maintenance entrance Daniel used to use to bring his bike in and out, and on impulse tried the old code he'd once given me for emergencies, never expecting it to still work. It did. I let myself into a shared storage area in the basement, found the unit that had once belonged to Daniel and Claire, still locked with the same padlock I remembered, and using a spare key, I recalled him keeping wedged behind the frame for exactly this kind of forgetful emergency. I opened it. Inside, among old boxes and furniture I recognized from their first apartment together, sat a small metal desk I didn't recognize, clearly added more recently than everything around it. In the top drawer beneath some loose papers, I found a sealed envelope with my own name written across the front in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere, shaky in a way that didn't match the confident penmanship I remembered from birthday cards over the years. Beneath my name in smaller letters was a single line that made my hands go cold before I'd even opened it. "If you're reading this, Dad, it means something's happened to me." The truth behind the disappearance? I sat down right there on the cold concrete floor of that storage unit, my back against a stack of boxes that still smelled faintly of the cedar chips Claire used to keep moths away, and I opened the envelope with hands that weren't entirely steady. Inside was a notebook, maybe 40 pages of Daniel's handwriting, dated entries spanning several months, the ink growing more hurried and cramped as the pages went on, like a man running out of time to say everything he needed to say. "I want to tell you what it was like reading my son's voice again after 2 years of silence, but I don't think I have the words for it exactly. It was like hearing him breathe again after believing somewhere underneath all my forced optimism that I might never hear from him at all." I read every page twice before I let myself leave that basement. The first entries were dated a little over 2 years ago, and they described, in Daniel's careful, methodical way, discoveries he'd started making about the company Claire had recently taken over as CEO. He'd been helping her informally with some of the financial modeling in her early days. Running the firm, Daniel had always been sharper with numbers than people gave him credit for, and in the process, he'd stumbled onto a pattern of transactions that didn't sit right with him. Money moving through a series of consulting contracts that seemed to exist only on paper. Payments flowing out to companies with no discernible product, no real staff, nothing but a name and a bank account. He'd started digging quietly the way I suppose I'd taught him to approach any problem, trace it back to the source before you draw conclusions. What he found terrified him. The shell companies traced back eventually to a man named Gordon Hale, operating under an assumed name, who had apparently spent months cultivating a relationship with several members of Claire's board before Daniel ever noticed him. Hale wasn't simply skimming money quietly. He was positioning himself patiently and deliberately to gain enough influence and trust within the company to eventually force a merger or acquisition that would hand him effective control of everything Claire had built while draining the company's reserves in the process. When Daniel confronted him directly, a decision my son described in his notebook, with a kind of grim, quiet regret, admitting he should have gone to the authorities first. Instead, Hale's response wasn't denial. It was a threat delivered calmly, almost pleasantly, the way genuinely dangerous men often deliver their worst warnings. Hale made it clear he had resources, connections, and a willingness to make Daniel's family's life extremely difficult if he pursued this any further. He mentioned Claire by name. He mentioned Ellie, not yet born at the time, but already known about, in a way that Daniel wrote, left no room for misunderstanding what kind of man he was dealing with. Daniel didn't run because he was afraid for himself. He wrote that plainly, and reading it, I believed him completely. He ran because Hale had made it clear that the safest way to protect Claire and their unborn daughter was for Daniel to disappear entirely, to remove himself as a target, to let Hale believe he'd successfully driven away the one person actively investigating him while Daniel worked from the shadows, quietly gathering the evidence that would eventually bring the whole scheme down. Claire knew. That much became clear reading further into the notebook. She and Daniel had made the decision together in the earliest, most frightened days of this whole situation that she would play along with Hale's growing presence in the company, allow him to believe he'd successfully inserted himself as the trusted father-in-law figure, keep him comfortable and unsuspecting, while she and Daniel worked separately through channels Hale wouldn't think to watch. To build a case against him? It was, I understood now, an almost unbearably difficult thing to ask of a young mother, to smile at a dangerous man every single day, to let her own child call him something close to family, all while carrying the terror of what he was capable of if he ever suspected the truth. I felt something in my chest crack open reading that part, a mixture of fierce pride in both of them and a deep, aching grief for everything they'd been forced to carry alone without ever letting me in. The notebook ended with a phone number written in the margin of the final page, along with a short note. If you find this and you need to reach me, use this number, but only from somewhere you're certain isn't watched. I love you, Dad. I'm sorry for all of it. I sat in that basement for what felt like a very long time before I finally worked up the nerve to dial it using a payphone I found 3 blocks away rather than risk my own cell. Some instinct telling me Daniel's warning about being watched wasn't something to take lightly. It rang 4 times before someone answered, and there was a long silence on the other end before a voice finally spoke, rougher than I remembered, worn down in a way 2 years apart can do to a person, but unmistakably, achingly, my son's voice. "Dad," he said, and I heard something break in his voice on that single word, disbelief and relief and fear all tangled together. How did you find this number?" "I found your notebook," I said, my own voice barely holding together. "Daniel, I know everything. I know about Hale. I know why you left." There was a long breath on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped even lower, urgent in a way that sent a fresh chill through me. "Dad, listen to me carefully," he said. "Whatever you do, you cannot let Gordon know you found out I'm alive. If he thinks for 1 second that I'm still out here, still watching, still building a case against him, everything Claire and I have spent 2 years protecting falls apart instantly. You have no idea what this man is capable of when he feels cornered." The plan to fight back. I stood in that phone booth for a long time after Daniel hung up the receiver, still warm against my ear, my mind racing through everything he'd just told me. He'd been living less than 3 hours away this entire time in a small rented house under a different name, working odd jobs that paid cash and kept him invisible, spending every spare hour building a case file that would one day be strong enough to bring Gordon Hale down for good. He hadn't been able to finish it alone. He needed someone he trusted completely, someone with no obvious connection to the company that Hale wouldn't already be watching. He needed me. Over the following 2 weeks, working carefully and always assuming Hale might have eyes somewhere, we couldn't see Daniel and I built something between us that I don't think either of us expected, a genuine partnership forged not through comfortable Sunday phone calls, but through necessity and fear, and the fierce protective love a father and son can rediscover when everything else has been stripped away. We communicated through burner phones Daniel arranged, meeting twice in person at a diner 2 counties over, always at odd hours, always watching the door. My engineering background turned out to matter more than I expected. Daniel had gathered plenty of financial documentation on his own, but he needed someone who understood systems, who could help make sense of the technical architecture behind how Hale had been moving money and manipulating records without leaving an obvious trail. I spent long nights at that diner with printouts spread across the table between us, tracing the same kind of fault lines I used to trace through failing machinery, not looking for where something broke, but for where someone had deliberately built it to fail in a way that benefited only them. Claire's role was the most dangerous, and I understood that better with every passing day. She continued showing up to work each morning, smiling at Gordon Hale, thanking him for his help, letting Ellie call him by whatever comfortable nickname the 2-year-old had picked up, watching her mother's forced warmth toward him. Underneath that performance, though, Claire had quietly begun working with an independent auditor Daniel had connected her with, someone entirely outside the company's usual financial oversight, and had started installing monitoring software on the internal systems Hale used most carefully enough that even the IT department had no idea it was there. "She's stronger than either of us," Daniel told me one night at that diner, his eyes red from exhaustion, a coffee going cold in front of him. "I don't know how she's done this every single day for 2 years without breaking." I thought about the strain I'd heard in Claire's voice on all those calls, the careful hesitations I'd mistaken for simple worry, and I understood now what I'd actually been hearing: a woman holding an entire family's safety together with nothing but her own composure and courage day after day, while everyone around her, including me, assumed she simply had things under control. The evidence, once we finally had all the pieces assembled, was damning in a way that left no real room for doubt. Fabricated consulting contracts routed through at least 6 shell companies, all traceable back to accounts under Gordon Hale's control. Falsified board minutes suggesting broader support for his growing influence than actually existed. And most damning of all, a paper trail showing Hale had been quietly courting a private equity firm, arranging the framework for a merger that would have handed him controlling interest in Claire's company, while draining what remained of its capital reserves into accounts that would disappear the moment the deal closed. There was one more piece: we needed a board meeting where Hale would formally present his merger proposal, the moment he'd clearly been building toward for 2 years. Claire discovered through a calendar invite that crossed her desk almost by accident that the meeting had already been scheduled less than a week away. We spent those final days finalizing everything with a lawyer Ray had recommended, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Denise Okafor, who specialized in corporate fraud, and who, upon reviewing what we'd assembled, told us bluntly that we had more than enough to end Gordon Hale's career and very possibly his freedom. The night before the board meeting, I sat alone in my hotel room, the same one I'd checked into what felt like a lifetime ago, running through everything one final time. My phone buzzed with a message from Claire, the first time she'd contacted me directly since I'd learned the truth. "Gordon just found out someone's been monitoring his accounts," the message read. "He's spooked. He might try to move up the timeline or destroy records. We can't wait for the scheduled meeting anymore. We have to move tomorrow morning before he has a chance to cover his tracks, or worse." I sat there staring at that message for a long time, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment settle over me. 2 years of my son hiding in plain sight, a daughter-in-law carrying a burden I never fully understood, and now, less than 12 hours away, the confrontation that would either end this nightmare or give Gordon Hale enough warning to disappear and start it all over again, somewhere else. Part 6. The truth comes out. I hadn't slept more than an hour by the time morning came, and I doubt Daniel had slept much better wherever he was hiding that night. Denise had arranged for the 2 of us, along with a company-hired forensic auditor she trusted, to be present at the board meeting under the pretense that Claire had invited outside consultants to review the merger proposal before the vote. Technically true, though not remotely in the way anyone in that room would expect. I arrived at the building early, dressed in the same suit I'd worn to my own retirement dinner years ago, feeling every one of my 66 years in my knees as I climbed the steps toward that glass entrance I'd first stood outside 3 weeks earlier, disguised then as nothing more than a confused old man looking for his daughter-in-law. This time, the guard at the front desk, the same young man from that first day, didn't recognize me at all as he waved me through toward the executive conference room on the 9th floor. The room itself was smaller than I'd imagined, a long table surrounded by perhaps a dozen board members, floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city skyline, and at the head of the table, standing with the easy, practiced confidence I now understood to be entirely manufactured, was Gordon Hale. He was mid-presentation when I slipped quietly into a seat near the back, a slide projected behind him, outlining the proposed merger. In language carefully engineered to sound like opportunity rather than theft, expanded market reach. Strategic synergies, the kind of hollow corporate phrasing designed to make people stop asking hard questions. Claire sat near the front, composed, professional, giving nothing away, though I noticed her hand tighten slightly around her pen when she caught sight of me entering the room. The doors opened again a few minutes later, and every head in that room turned. Daniel walked in. I don't think I've ever seen a room go silent quite that fast. He looked different than I remembered, thinner, a beard he hadn't worn before, tired in a way that spoke to everything he'd carried these past 2 years. But it was unmistakably my son standing in that doorway with a quiet, controlled fury that I recognized because I'd felt something like it myself these past 3 weeks. Gordon Hale's composure cracked for just a fraction of a second, a flicker quickly smoothed over, but I caught it, and I think everyone else in that room caught it too. "Daniel," he said, his voice carrying an edge of forced surprise, "this is unexpected. We all believed you were still overseas." "I imagine you did," Daniel said, walking further into the room, taking a position standing beside Claire's chair rather than sitting down. "Given that you're the one who threatened my family if I didn't disappear." The room erupted into murmurs, board members exchanging confused, alarmed glances. Hale attempted to laugh it off, something about grief and stress, causing people to say things they don't mean, but the confidence that had carried him through 2 years of careful manipulation was visibly beginning to fracture. Denise stood then, opening her laptop, connecting it to the room's display, without waiting for anyone's permission. "Before this board votes on anything," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension, "I'd like to walk everyone through some documentation that came to light over the past several weeks." What followed was methodical, devastating, and precisely as thorough as Daniel and I had spent 2 weeks preparing it to be. Shell company after shell company, traced back through banking records to accounts under Gordon Hale's actual name. Not Bennett, a name Denise made a point of stating clearly for the room, along with a brief summary of his history with the earlier fraud case 15 years prior that most people in that room had clearly never heard about. Falsified contracts, board minutes that misrepresented actual votes and discussions, and finally the merger paperwork itself laid bare for what it actually was: a mechanism to hand Hale controlling interest in the company while draining its financial reserves into accounts that traced ultimately to an offshore holding structure with no legitimate business purpose whatsoever. Claire stood as the presentation concluded, and I watched my daughter-in-law address that boardroom with a composure that made something swell painfully in my chest. Pride and grief tangled together in a way I hadn't expected. "I've known who this man really was for over a year," she said, her voice steady despite what it must have cost her. "I let him believe I trusted him completely because it was the only way to protect my husband and my daughter while we built the case that's now in front of you. I'm sorry for the deception. I'm not sorry for protecting my family." The vote, when it came, wasn't close. The board terminated Gordon Hale's advisory role, immediately voided every agreement bearing his signature, and authorized Denise to forward the entire case file directly to federal fraud investigators before the meeting had even fully adjourned. Security arrived within minutes to escort Hale from the building, and I watched the man who had spent 2 years wearing my role, my title, my place in my family's life, finally stripped of the confidence that had carried him this far. He didn't go quietly, though. As the security guards took hold of his arms, he turned back toward Daniel, and whatever composure remained on his face twisted into something colder, something that made the hair on my arms rise for the second time in 3 weeks. "You think this is over?" he said, low enough that only those of us nearby could hear it clearly. "You have no idea who I actually answer to. This isn't finished, not even close. Family reunited, justice served." Gordon Hale's final words hung in that conference room for a moment after security pulled him through the doors, and I won't pretend they didn't unsettle all of us. Denise assured everyone once the room had a chance to breathe again that federal investigators would take that threat seriously as part of their broader inquiry, that men like Hale rarely operate entirely alone, and that whatever network had allowed him to disappear and reinvent himself once before would now be part of what investigators dug into. I won't say that thread is fully resolved even now, weeks later. Some things take time to unravel properly, and I've learned enough these past few months to know that real justice, unlike the version I used to imagine in simpler terms, is rarely a single tidy ending. It's a process, sometimes a slow one. And I've made my peace with letting the people whose job it is to finish it do exactly that. What I can tell you is that Gordon Hale was arrested within the week on charges of securities, fraud, wire fraud, extortion, and several related counts tied to both this case and eventually Thread's investigators connected back to that earlier collapsed firm from 15 years before. His bail was denied given what prosecutors described as a demonstrated pattern of evading accountability by disappearing and rebuilding under new identities. Whatever network he referenced with that parting threat is now, from what Denise tells us, very much a part of the ongoing federal investigation. And I trust, as much as an old man can trust a system, he doesn't fully understand that it will be handled the way it needs to be. Daniel came home 3 days after that board meeting, properly home. Not in secret, not looking over his shoulder every few minutes the way he'd described feeling for 2 straight years. I was there when he walked through Claire's front door, and Ellie, not quite 2 years old, looked up from her toys with the cautious uncertainty of a child meeting a stranger, because in every way that mattered to her small life, that's exactly what he was. I watched my son kneel down slowly, carefully, and introduce himself to his own daughter for what felt to all of us standing in that room like the very first time. It took her a few minutes, then she reached out and touched his beard, curious, and something in Daniel's face broke open in a way I don't think I'll ever forget. Relief and grief and joy, all arriving at once the way they sometimes do when a person has been holding too much for too long. Claire and Daniel have spent the months since working through what 2 years of enforced separation does to a marriage, even one built on the kind of trust theirs clearly was. I won't pretend it's been simple. There's a particular exhaustion in both of them that I don't think will fade quickly, the residue of having carried something enormous and dangerous, almost entirely alone, even while technically working toward the same goal. But I've watched them rebuild slowly, deliberately. The same careful way Daniel and I traced through Hale's financial records at that diner 2 counties over, not looking for what broke, but building piece by piece towards something that holds. The company itself has undergone a full restructuring with new, more rigorous oversight built into how outside advisors are vetted and approved, something the board insisted on unanimously once the full scope of what had happened became clear. Claire remains CEO, sharper and more careful now, though I think something in her that used to assume good faith in people has been permanently, understandably altered. Daniel works alongside her now in a smaller capacity, helping rebuild the financial systems Hale had corrupted, though he's told me more than once that he has no interest in ever again being the kind of man who disappears from his own family's life, no matter the reason. As for me, I go back to that town outside Dayton most weeks now, but not for long. I find myself making the 4-hour drive far more often than I used to, not for anniversaries or emergencies, but simply to sit at Claire's kitchen table the way I once sat at my own with a much younger version of my son across from me, or to take Ellie to the park down the street from their house, watching her chase pigeons with the kind of uncomplicated joy that reminds me every time exactly what all of this was actually for. I think back often to that afternoon, 3 weeks that changed everything. Standing outside a glass building, holding a wrapped pocket watch, being laughed at by a young security guard who had no idea he was about to hand me the loose thread that would unravel 2 years of my family's carefully hidden pain. I've turned that pocket watch over in my hands many times since, thinking about how something small and ordinary, a simple gift I almost didn't bother bringing, ended up being the reason I finally saw what had been happening right in front of me all along. If there's one thing I've come to understand from all of this, it's that love, real love, the kind that holds a family together through the worst of circumstances, doesn't always look like honesty in the moment. Sometimes it looks like silence, like a wife smiling at a dangerous man every single day to protect her husband and child, like a son disappearing entirely because staying would have put everyone he loved at greater risk. It isn't the kind of love that makes for an easy story while you're living inside it, but it's real and it's strong, and I'm more grateful than I know how to properly say that mine came back to me whole. I wanted to share this with you tonight because I know so many families are quietly carrying things they can't fully explain to the people around them, holding pieces together in ways that look strange from the outside, but make complete sense once you understand what they were protecting. If any part of this story reached you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what it stirred up for you. Leave a comment below and let me know. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you, so please subscribe so you don't miss a single moment like this. Let's keep this journey going together.